Hello, and welcome to the 6th lesson in the AQS Let's Quilt Beginner Series with Bonnie. And today we're mainly going to talk about finishing our quilt, but I'm going to start off because I realized that I really didn't give you much information about the different kinds of batting that are available to you. So I have 3 different styles here on the table, and this first one is polyester batting, and it's called Thermore. And all of these battens are from Hobbs bonded fibers. The second one that I have here is wool, and this is 100% wool that has been super washed and then resin bonded. So that helps keep all those wool fibers together. And while that first one is about 1/8 of an inch thick, this one can be up to 3/8 of an inch thick, 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch thick. And this one is cotton, and you can see that cotton is like about 1/4 of an inch thick. They also come in cotton with polyester, an 80-20 blend, 80% cotton and 20% polyester. This one is fusible. So if you were making particularly for wall quilts, this is just really handy to be able to fuse the batting. Fusible on both sides so that you can fuse the backing on the back side and the quilt top on the front side. So I'm going to show you both the Thermore and the wool of how that looks. And before we do that, we have sponsors for this show. We're going to have a quick word from 2 of our sponsors. We'll be back, and then we're going to talk about how to trim your quilt so that you can get ready to put the binding on.
A machine with endurance is important. That's why I own the Janome Continental M7. Janome, reliability by design.
Okay, I have the quilt hanging on the wall now, and this particular quilt I added the wool batting in. And so if you want one that's real cuddly, a little bit poofy, the wool batting works really well for this. And some of the long arm quilters, and I think the home machine quilters too, sometimes put a layer of wool on top of a layer of cotton because it gives you kind of a faux trapunto look to your quilt without having to do any stuffing. So remember that little tip. Now, I want to tell you, when I got ready to quilt this quilt, I tried to figure out how could I quilt all the way from side to side, edge to edge with the quilt. And it sounds real good if you start here, okay, and I can go all the way down through the middle, can I? But what happens if I start here? All right, now I'm going to run into our sashing strip. So what I did was I went this way, and 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 this way. And so by doing that, just with those little jogs, I was able to quilt all the way across the entire quilt. So I don't know how far you are on your quilting, but it took me an entire weekend to quilt this quilt. All right, so now I'm going to show you, I made a table runner for us to use to show this because it's a little bit smaller and easier for you to see. But you'll notice that I used that Thermore batting in here, and I used it in this because it is a table runner and I want it to be fairly flat. If you're going to set anything on it, you don't want it to wobble. But I also want you to see what I did with the quilting. I quilted it all with just a single line of quilting, like right here. And I thought, gosh, that looks pretty plain. What could I do? And so what I did was I sewed the width of my presser foot on both sides of that line. Doesn't it add a lot of interest? Now, it takes you 3 times as long to do it that way too. And then I decided on the borders, I just did the width of the presser foot from the edge. And I did a double line, and now once I get the binding on, I'm going to go back in and add another line of quilting in there. But because I'm going to trim it, You know, I didn't want to go with the edge of the quilt because you can see, if you look at right here, you can see this isn't a nice square corner. So we've got some trimming to do. You'll remember that I marked my ruler when we were cutting strips with the blue tape. And I've done that again, and I'm going to trim this off so that I'm measuring 2 inches from the sewn seam. And so I'm going to line up the line right here, and I'm going to put 2 inches and 2 inches, and guess I need to pull this down here a little bit further so that I can actually make that cut. 2 inches and 2 inches. And so now I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and cut, move my hand. Now just slide it down here so I can get to the rest of it here. And again, I'm going to line up on one of my sewn seams for me to line up right here so that you've got it squared. And my 2 inches up there. And I'm ready to cut the rest of the seam. Okay, so that's the first edge. Let's just get rid of this. So now it will be really important for me to make sure that I have the line on the ruler along this edge to give us a 90-degree angle right here at the corner. Okay, so now we're ready to do the third corner, and again I'm going to line the ruler right up here along my cut edge, and I'm going to line 2 inches all the way along and trim. And so you just slide it down until you get the whole edge trimmed. And you can see I'm also lining up the edge right here with my ruler, with my cut edge. And we have one more edge to do. And again, we're going to align 2 inches on the seam line. And that's how easy it is to trim your quilt. And so we're going to take a short break and hear from a couple more of our sponsors. And when we come back, I'm going to show you how to make your binding and attach it to your quilt.
Scissorman here, founder of Fomori Cutlery. Chances are, if you're watching this, you're a needle artist. And needle artists like yourself from around the world have trusted the Fomori brand as their preferred cutting instruments for the past 20 years. To learn more, go to famcut.com.
All right, so we need to make binding to go around the edge of our quilt. I've cut these strips 2 1/4 inches. You also could cut them 2 1/2 inches. Either one of those will work. Actually, I wished I'd have cut mine just a little bit wider on this because I used that thick wool batting. It probably would have made the binding fold over the edge of the quilt just a little easier. How do we determine how wide to cut the binding? You need 6 times the finished width of your binding. And let me show you how you figure that out. First of all, we're going to sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that's 2. And then it's going to go on the front of the quilt, that's 4. And on the back of the quilt is 6, and that makes our finished binding. All right, so I want my binding to finish about 3/8 of an inch. And so if you take 6 times 3/8, so that's 6 times 3 is 18 over 8, means you need to cut your binding 2 1/4 inches wide. So if you wanted a 1/2 inch wide binding and you took it times 6, you could see that you would have to have it 3 inches wide to be able to have it fit the edge of the quilt properly. So all right, let me show you how to make this binding. Well, we're going to join the ends of our binding with a diagonal seam. And so I have the wrong side up. And how do you tell the right and the wrong side? Usually these heavy creases that you see on the fabric is going to be the right side. And so I'm going to take, and first of all, I'm going to fold a 45-degree angle, and I'm just going to finger press it. You just want to make sure you don't stretch that edge, but just kind of take your thumb and just scrape in there a little bit, because that's going to be our stitching line. Okay, so now I have the right side of the next piece, and I'm going to lay it over that corner I just laid there, and I'm going to pick it up. And so now I have right sides together on both of these fabrics. I'm going to align them. And this is one place that I usually do use a couple pins, just because it can slide on you very easily. And you'll notice that I'm putting these pins in here out of my way so that I can sew this seam. All right, so let's go sew it. All right, now one of the things that I always do when I get this far is I always open it up, and you can see those line up very well. So the next thing I can do is take my scissors and trim and just leave a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to finger press that seam open, just like we just finger pressed it a little bit ago. You could take it to the iron, but you really don't need to. And so that's how easy it is. I'm going to do it one more time so I can show you. All right, so now I know this is the right side. Here's our seam from our last stitching. So again, I'm going to take and fold that triangle toward myself. The right side, and you notice I'm looking to see where the creases are in the fabric. I'm going to lay the right side on that triangle. Now, let me just tell you that if you get ready to sew these together, and this doesn't look like an A, you see the line across and 2 legs on the A, you're going to sew across that line. If it doesn't look like this, then you don't have them put together properly. So again, we'll put a pin and another pin just to hold it. And again, okay, now I will just tell you this, you do want to check to make sure it's the same as the last one, because when I was making the binding for my quilt, I had one of these turned around. So I got my piece twisted. So you do want to check it before you, otherwise I would just come back, if you make a mistake, come back and just cut this off and do it again, which is exactly what I did. All right, so again, I would unfold this, finger press, fold it back up, take your scissors and trim the seam allowance. And so now the next thing we do with this is we're going to take it to the iron, and we're going to press this whole big long length, wrong sides together, so that it's folded in half. We're going to take another short break and hear from some of our sponsors, and when I come back, we're going to sew binding onto our quilt.
Trust the quality of Coats & Clark threads for all your quilting needs. With over 200 years of commitment to quality, selection, and innovation, Coats & Clark is the thread company trusted for generations. Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's Tables are made in the USA.
So okay, I'm getting ready to sew my binding on now. And the one thing you want to make sure that you do is leave about a 10 or 12 inch tail at both the beginning and at the ending of your sewing the binding on. I usually start so that you can do your joint on the edge of the quilt in the middle somewhere here. So I'm going to start and lay my binding on here. I've set the machine so it will sew 1/4 of an inch from the edge of my presser foot. So I'm just going to put the presser foot down. And now I'm just going to align my binding right with the edge of the quilt and sew. All right, so one of the things that I always do when you get about to this point and it's up on the table, I'm going to put a pin at 1/4 of an inch from the corner, because that's going to tell me that I'm going to stop right there. So I'm going to align my binding back up, and now we can just sew to the corner. Now when I get close to my pin, I'm going to go slow so that I can do a couple back stitches when I get to that pin. One more, and I'm going to back stitch a couple stitches. And now you have to cut your thread. There is no way to put this binding on properly without cutting your thread. Okay, so now my pin has done its job. Okay, so now I've broken the thread, and I'm going to fold in the 45-degree angle. And I'm just going to take that strip of binding, and what you want to do is you want to align the binding with this edge of the quilt that you're going to sew next. So here's my 45-degree angle. I'm going to take that binding strip and I'm going to align it right there along that top edge so that it makes a good corner. Okay, now this is another place where you probably want to use a pin, because once you pick it up, it's going to want to shift on you. So I'm going to put a pin right here just to hold that binding until I get going. So again, I'm going to start from the very edge of the quilt. And once you get going, you can get rid of that pin. I try to get those pins out as soon as I can. All right, now before we go too far, I want to mark that 1/4 of an inch from the corner with a pin. Back stitch, cut your thread, and so now we'll do that same thing again. We're going to take our binding and we're going to fold the 45-degree angle and align the raw edge with the raw edge of your quilt. Pull the binding back on itself. Now it should align with the raw edge here. pin to hold it. And now we're ready to start from the edge of the quilt again. Sometimes you'll get it where it won't have that fold of your fabric right there on the edge, and you just want to double check that every time. One more corner. Okay, now you remember that we started with this big long tail here. We want to back off about a foot or so from that so that we have plenty of room to work. So I'm going to put another pin in so I know where to stop and leave my tail hanging. All right, now just take a couple back stitches, and again we're going to cut our thread. Okay, so now here's where the fun comes, because I have two big long tails, don't I? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the one that was my starting, and you see how much space we have here? I'm going to come about in the middle of that space. And I'm going to come and take my scissors and I'm just going to make a cut. All right, now this is your measuring stick so that you don't even have to use a ruler to use this method. But I'm going to take that tail and I'm just going to lay it off the edge just ever so slightly so I can bring this tail, the end, that was the beginning, this is the end. I'm going to bring it over and lay it right on top. And now I will tell you, you'll only do this one time, because if you do it, you'll have to go back and tear out part of your binding and splice it somewhere because you'll cut it too short. So the tendency is that, okay, so I should be able to cut it right here where the beginning starts and the end stops. But you have to be able to join those ends together. So The reason I had you cut this tail off is that's our measuring stick, and I'm going to lay it right there. And so now you know that you have to cut that longer, and that's how much longer. So I'm just going to stick a pin right here. Now I can pick this tail up, and I can come back and I can take my scissors and I can trim that off right there where my pin is. And now I have the perfect measurement to join these ends. You remember when we made our binding, I had you fold, and so I'm going to have you open this up, and I'm going to have you do that same thing where you're going to fold that triangle right there. This is the wrong side, okay? And I'm going to take this tail and I'm going to open it up as well. This is exactly what we did when we made our binding. First of all, I want you to make sure you finger press that really, really well. So let's do that before I go on. Because that's the cross on our A, remember? This is the cross on our A. So you just want to press that, finger press that good enough that we'll be able to see that when we get ready to sew. All right, so now I'm going to take my beginning end and open it up, and this is the right side, and this is the right side. So just like we did before, going to pick these up, and now you can see why I told you to be sure you leave some space in there, because just like when we made the binding to begin with, here's the cross on our A, one leg of the A, the other leg of the A, and you can see how if you don't leave enough room between these two spaces, it's really hard to sew. And again, just like I did when we made our binding, I'm going to put a couple pins in here. Get this opened up good, lined up. Another pin. And now I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine. So you can see the legs of the A, and here's the cross of the A, and that's what we're going to sew. We're going to do exactly the same thing we did when we did our binding. I'm going to take and I'm going to open it up and finger press it open. And now I'm going to double check it, because what should happen is there's enough right there that it finishes the edge of that binding. So I'm going to trim this and then I'll stitch that in place, and our binding will be on the front of the quilt. Make sure that that seam lays open. That spreads out any bulk that would cause. And now I'm ready to finish this edge of the quilt. Completely sewn on. You see how nice and flat that is there? It fits in there perfectly. There we go. Our binding's all done. Okay, so this is how our binding looked when we got it all sewn on there. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to flip it to the back side. And I want to just warn you right here, because sometimes people are tempted to trim out this corner. You really don't want to do that, and I'll show you why. I always start when I get ready to flip it to the back is, okay, so I've I've flipped it to the back. Here's the 45-degree angle we folded in that fabric. And so now on the back side, we're going to fold it, and all we're going to do is we're going to cover that seam that we already have sewn it on with. Now, remember I told you that these clips come in really handy? This is where these clips come in really handy. All right, so now I folded that one that direction. So now I'm going to take it and I'm going to fold the whole corner. All right, see if I can get my fingers out of the way. So do you see how we have a 45-degree angle on the back side as well? And I almost always hand sew my binding on the back side. Now, if I were making quilts for children where you're going to wash them a lot, I probably would sew the binding to the front side of the back side of the quilt and bring it over to the front. And then I might use a decorative stitch to stitch it down. But if I were going to use this on my table, I probably don't want that, so I'm going to do it by hand. And so I'm going to show you next how I do that. And I have a needle here all threaded up, and this is just a number 10 between quilting needle. And I'm going to put a little knot, and I don't know, do you all know how to do the quilter's knot? Let me show you. I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to lay it on the length of the needle and hold it with my right hand. Now I'm going to wrap the thread 3 or 4 times. And the more times you wrap it around there, it'll make a slightly bigger knot. All right, so now I've got that, those wraps are held with my fingers. I'm just going to take the needle, I don't want to stick it in my, I'm going to take the needle and just push it through and hold on to those wraps until they get to the very end. And can you see that tiny little knot we just made? So I am going to trim that tail. We don't need a tail quite that long. I would take my thread and I'm going to bury it, and I would just come in here and bury it in the seam allowance. And now I'm just going to use my fingers and I'm going to take a short stitch down and a small bite coming up. And I don't know how many of you are used to using a thimble, but when you get used to using a thimble, you almost can't stitch without one because you'll make mincemeat out of your fingers. So I'm going to push with my thimble. Okay, so again, I'm going to go into the background and just come up with a tiny little bite along the edge of the binding. Now, I know sometimes people say, well, how close do you need to make those stitches? Well, if you were sewing this on the sewing machine, you'd probably do it about 10 or 12 stitches to the inch. That's how close you should be doing this. The first thing that will wear out on any quilt will be the binding. So the more secure you can have it, and of course we've doubled it so that it's double thickness of fabric. This is the same stitch I use when I applique too, so hopefully your stitches are pretty hidden because you're just coming up right on the edge of that fabric. Okay, so now we're almost at the corner, and I just want to show you one of the things that you want to do is stitch this binding closed here on the 45-degree angle, both on the front and on the back of the quilt. That's a spot that can get caught and then cause your binding to not wear so well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch right into the back side of this. I guess I need to take one more stitch first here. All right, so now I'm going to come and I'm going to catch both this edge and the opposite edge. You're going through a lot of fabric there, so it's hard to pull. There we go. All right, so now once I've done that, I'm just going to take a stitch in place to just hold that. Because now I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to insert it right there in that corner, and I'm going to come up. I'm going to come up on the front side. So see where my needle came up right there in the base of that 45-degree angle. So I'm going to do here what I call the ladder stitch, and I'm going to take one little stitch in the bottom fabric and one little stitch in the top fabric right along that edge. And this only takes 3 or 4 stitches to stitch this closed. But if you remember to do that as you're coming to the corner. Now, one thing I want you to notice, do you see, because we left all of that fabric in there, what a beautiful square corner we've been able to make? So we don't want to mess with that. I'm going to take one more stitch here on the front. And now I'm going to slide my needle right through that point. And now I'm going to stitch down the back side exactly the same way. Again, going one stitch in the top, one stitch in the bottom. Okay, and so now we're ready to continue on, and our corner is all stitched down, and we're ready now to go ahead and continue right down the side just like we did the other one. So when you get that all done, your quilt will all be done except for putting a label on it to tell who made it, when you made it, what you made it for. If it's a gift, put that occasion on your label so that down the road, years from now, people will know that it was made by you and it was handmade and when you made it. Well, now I told you that we had some great prizes from our sponsors, and certainly you all are going to want to make sure that you go register for these prizes. Let me tell you what the prizes are, because it's a wonderful list and quite a few of you are going to win some wonderful prizes. For Janome, they're going to be giving us a 5300 QDC series sewing machine with a retail value of $1,399. From AQUilt, one prize winner will receive a Go Big electric fabric cutter. Now we used the manual one here on the show, but someone's going to win the electric one with a starter set that's with a retail value of $599. Coats & Clark is going to give 5 winners 50 spools of dual duty all-purpose thread and 32 spools of So Happy dual duty all-purpose thread, and each of those has a retail value of $106. Daylight Company gave us 3 different lights to use, and you know we've used one here on the set, and I have to tell you, this is natural light, as natural as if it were coming in your window. And they're going to be giving a luminous light that's retail valued at $415. A slimline light, and this is the light that I have on my sewing machine at home, has a retail value of $215. And the Halo Go light has a retail value of $130. 3 lucky winners there. The Fomori Cutlery Company is going to be giving 5 $100 gift certificates to 5 lucky people out there so that you can choose what you want. And just today I received a picture of their brand new cutter with its handle, and this blade on their rotary cutter is like no other blade. It will last 4 times longer than a traditional blade. It's carbide tungsten steel. and it is really sharp. You'll think you're cutting through butter with that blade. And we've been using this wonderful cabinet from Tracy's Tables through the whole series, and someone's going to win their 3-drawer cutting table. I have that at home too. And it's a retail value of $760. So be sure to have all your friends go register. The drawing will be after December 8th. You can register until 11:59 on December 8th, and that's Central Time. So make sure you go register and have all your friends register as well, because someone's going to win all these wonderful prizes. I want to thank you all for joining us for this first class that we've done in the beginning series. We've already started working on the next one, and we'll be working with triangles. So I hope you'll join us there. And of course, you know you can always find everything that you want about quilting on AmericanQuilter.com, QuiltWeek.com, which is where this resides, and that's where you go register. QuiltWeek.com/Let's Quilt is the place to go register. And don't miss all of the videos that we're putting on Quilt TV on YouTube. You can go to quilttv.com to get there, or you can go to YouTube/QuiltTV, but we have thousands of videos out there for you to see. So thank you again for joining us for the very first AQS Let's Quilt class, and we'll see you very soon with class number 2. Thanks for joining us.